Our final speaker tonight is the William Rand Keenan Professor of Philosophy at Emory University, Robert McCauley. He's one of the founders of the field of cognitive science and religion, so we're really grateful and pleased that he made the long journey here from Georgia to join us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Special thanks, by the way, to Adam Barnett, who helped me with some crucial matters in getting prepared for today. Sometimes it just really matters who your friends are. I think I'm here because of who my friends are. That is to say, I have a whole bunch of friends that live right here in Vancouver, and I've also got some friends who have been some folks who have criticized various features of the program that is being so ably developed here. So I hope that this will reflect some balance, because I actually have, one might say, broad sympathies for both positions. This is also, I'm going to add, going to be a pretty simple talk. I hope not so much that I end up constituting comic relief, but it is 10 o'clock at night where I am. Okay. I'm going to do three things in this talk. First, some preliminaries in which I hope to provide some organizing frameworks for situating the discussion about the position that you've heard about and some of alternative positions and criticisms, and maybe perhaps even to some extent situate the workshop. Then I want to turn to some theoretical alternatives and concerns. Now, the fact of the matter is I'm only going to talk about one of them, but there are many. There are a number of alternatives and concerns out there, but you only have so much time, and I'm sure I'm going to end up taking more than they wanted me to take. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about some concerns about the facts. Now, in some ways, in thinking about this talk, because I've been ruminating about it for quite some time, this is a little misleading because it's going to turn out that I'm really interested in kind of a certain amount of conceptual vagueness. But it has to do with how concepts get sort of allocated, or how the facts get allocated to the concepts and the concepts to the facts. Those concern, frankly, prehistory, history, and psychology. Okay, so let's get started. First part, preliminary, the underlying questions. Like I said, this is a simple talk. Among increasing group size, agriculture, mechanisms of social cohesion, widespread cooperation in in settings that involve anonymity, prosocial religions, religions with morally interested big gods, costly signaling, credibility enhancing displays, and frankly, a whole lot more. The two crucial questions are what causes what, and when did the pertinent causal processes commence? Now, that said, and I take it presumably this conference is, the assumption is you folks are going to be able to help the UBC group a lot with getting answers to these questions, and I presume especially the second, where I think your expertise will be particularly valued. Now, Ara Norenzayan, and of course his book Big Gods, which Joe was advertising, is sort of the ur text here, offered a clarification, actually, in which he said the following. There is no single mechanism underlying religion's prosocial effects. Now, a tremendous amount of ink has actually already been spilled about a book that's really pretty new, which shows its impact, about the direction of the causal arrows, about all those variables that I was just talking to you about. Ara's book had a great attention-grabbing title, but there's a downside to that, and that is everybody got really preoccupied with big gods. All right? So Ara, as a way of sort of managing this problem, proposed the following alternative 50-word Victorian title for his book, which is that, okay? And I won't read it to you. You can read it to yourselves faster than I read it out loud, so just read it. I'll take a drink of water. Okay, on the assumption everybody can read that fast, let me charge ahead, and that is to say, I actually don't know the answer to this. Have all the people here read the BBS paper? Was it? Oh. They've been sent it. Okay, you don't know if they've read it. Okay. All right. The UBC group has subsequently produced a paper, a collective paper since, that it seems to me explicates a more nuanced and elaborated argument that in effect is really sort of this argument, right? Stressing the probabilistic character of the evidence, the autocatalytic relations between increasing group size and big gods, the gradual character and the variability of the historical transitions, and so on. I mean, and that's what I take to count as, among other things, nuance. Now, there are various theoretical proposals from the world of evolutionary thought for managing these issues, okay? And that's what I want to present in this next slide. And I'm going to use considerations of the level of selection and the mechanisms of selection in order to sort of situate a bunch of positions for you and give you a sense of sort of where things at. I need to warn you because byproduct theory and byproduct talk turns out to be ambiguous in this literature now. It's applied both at the psychological level and at the cultural, sort of social cultural level. I'm talking about the psychological level right here, and there's a sense in which the UBC folks and the critics that I'm going to talk about, or at least some of the critics that I'm going to talk about, agree about this, which is to say, the argument is that, of this view, is that the relevant psychological mechanisms that underlie all the kinds of things that we've been talking about are, in fact, things that have occurred because of natural selection at these two levels. But they're not about religion. They're there for completely different reasons, having to do with the sort of the evolutionary history of our species. And it turns out that religions, and actually lots of other cultural products as well, just turn out to be really good at engaging these capacities and eliciting certain kinds of responses. I mean, I could give you a host of examples. This is actually what a fair amount of my research has been about over the years, but I'm not going to take time with that. I'm just going to tell you about that, okay? Now, there are other people who also look to natural selection at these two levels, okay? There are some names. I had to sort of fit them in on both sides of byproduct there. But these folks are not byproduct theorists, all right? They are folks who think that religion is in fact individually adaptive. And so in effect that some of these sensibilities and religious sensibilities were literally selected for. That in a sense, if you are inclined to believe there's a God watching you, you're going to turn out to be a better person and more careful and more honest and all those sorts of things. And this will make you, in short, a better person to do all sorts of things with, trade with, have sex with, and reproduce with, and so on. Okay? There is also a literature out there on sexual selection. It's not a literature that's, it's sort of new in some ways, at least with regard to religion. These are some of the folks that are out there. I'm not going to say any more than just the fact that they exist. Then there is the cultural selection, and this is the UBC sort of project here, okay? It emphasizes in-group solidarity and parochial altruism. David Sloan Wilson, by the way, is a name, other pointer, that you see here popping up a couple of places, okay? And it seems to me that he both actually advocates group level selection, an extremely controversial view. I'll just leave it at that, okay? But at times it seems to me that his language is also sort of over here, and he seems to be regarding himself as an ally of the cultural group selectionists, okay? Cultural group selection, okay, so that's cultural selection at the group level, okay, this cell down here, is in effect the UBC position, it seems to me. This is, in fact, what Joe did a magnificent job of, with an incredible economy, laying out. Now, interestingly enough, although that's sort of the prevailing view, as it were, Scott Atran and Joe actually published a paper a few years back in which they made, it seems to me, an important point, a logical point, and that is all of these views, in fact, are compatible. None of them rules out any of the other ones, which is to say that all of them could be true about some parts of religion or other. So you could have all of these things. Now, it doesn't follow that, in fact, they all are true. Okay, but at least that's a possibility. In his 2014, very recent response to critics, Ara starts discussing blind men figuring out what an elephant is like. So that said, let me turn to part two, and with regard to compatibility and truth and so on here. And that is to talk about at least one sort of theoretical alternative. But I want to make a kind of general comment about at least all of the literature that I know of that constitutes the critics of this view. And that is, there are a couple of things that they seem to have in common. The first is they all tend, not surprisingly, to downplay cultural group selection. Mostly they are advocates of individual selection and natural selection, okay? And secondly, they see substantial cooperation, and I stuck morality in there, but let's just say cooperation. They see substantial cooperation either prior to the emergence of large-scale societies or prior to and without pro-social religions that have big gods as moral monitors. That seems to me to be the direction of most of the criticism I've seen that's out there. Okay? So with regard to the latter point, for example, the latter point being number 2, B in particular here, okay? Here is some passages from a paper by Nicolas Baumard and Pascal Boyer. This is, as it were, the one theoretical view I'll talk about, what I'll call the, sort of the alternative view from the standpoint of the evolutionary psychologists. The theoretical proposal is in green, right? Cognitive accounts of human cultures take as a starting point the fact that genetic evolution produced a suite of psychological dispositions typical in modern Homo sapiens. Evolved moral intuitions are sufficient to nudge humans toward cooperative behavior, okay? Now, the controversial claim is that evolved psychology suffices to account, for most or all of cooperation, all right? Some more from, actually, it's the same paper. And I should add that this is part, this program generally is part of what I would say is applying that byproduct theory that I was laying out for you with regard to morality, okay? Which is to say that the same story about our moral intuitions and that part of our evolved psychology is yet another thing that religion does a really great job of figuring out how to engage. And so it gets people interested, okay? Again, I want to stress there are other kinds of byproducts as well. And note, by the way, there isn't a necessary condition here. So there's going to be an historical point that these guys are going to want to press. And that is, if you look at the ancient period, and specifically in the axial age, that the fact of the matter is there are lots of groups out there that pop up that have moral interests and interests in cooperation and have even communities that aren't religious. So, for example, the Stoics. As at least one illustration that I have a tiny little bit of familiarity about. Okay, but they proceed to the further claim that is in red here. Oh, sorry, I should read the one that's in green. Automatic intuitions precede conscious moral reasoning as well as the explicit justification of moral choices. That's why moral intuitions are the same in religious and non-religious people, okay? Everybody's got the same moral intuitions because it's part of our evolved psychology. And adherence to particular beliefs only marginally affects pro-social behaviors. Okay? Now, I should add that I put this in red because I take it that that particular sentence is like waving a red cape in front of the UBC crowd, okay? Getting their attention here, okay? The first point I would make about this, and like I said, I have friends on both sides here, is that this view isn't a necessary consequence of everything else that they said prior to this. Okay, it is in effect something that's asserted in addition. And I take it that it's at least somewhat controversial in light of just the sort of evidence that Joe reviewed in his talk, experimental evidence regarding priming and economic games across cultures, the apparent inability to explain findings. Actually, Joe didn't talk about this. There are also, excuse me, other studies out there that show that there are other factors that seem to sort of correlate pretty well with big gods. One of them is sort of animal husbandry. Another is pointed out actually by my colleague at Emory, John Sneary, is water scarcity. When you have these kinds of conditions, these things correlate pretty well with big gods. And one of the counter arguments that the UBC folks have made is well, this view up here, right, this sort of psychology or evolved psychology only view is going to be unable to make much sense of those kinds of findings. Okay, that said, I'm going to take one more step with regard to this second part about theoretical alternatives and concerns. I want to look briefly at three further considerations that are in various texts the UBC group have raised in response to this evolved psychology only position. Frankly, I've got a mixed view about these three. I'm going to sort of, I think, want to endorse two of them, but the third one well, you'll see. Okay. First one is, well, we've got to allow for gradual transitions. That was this point about the fact that these are probabilistic views, that there's a good deal of variability. Presumably you folks are just going to tell them that all this weekend. But neither the bigness of big gods nor the prosociality of prosocial religions are all or nothing phenomena. Okay? I think that's right. Secondly, the transitions occur at different times in different places. One of the points they make is that this isn't just a point about sort of transition from, with regard to the axial age, for example. I mean, Islam gets started in the 7th century, but it's one of the biggest of the big god religions. Okay, and then they go on to say that there's ample evidence of prosocial dimensions of religions prior to the axial age. They cite Robert Bella's, huge work, Religion and Human Evolution, and it certainly gets to the gradualness issue, number one up there, right? But still, it seems a somewhat less clear call to me. So let me just show you some of the contexts in which these claims that they look to come out of in Bella's book. Bella is here talking about pre-axial age Mesopotamian religions. Bella's comments, however, don't seem to me to quite suggest anything quite as full-blooded as the sort of prosocial religions of big god moral monitors. I'm not going to charge through all that, but needless to say, pay attention to the text that's in red. So, indeed, I'd like to suggest that much does lurk behind those all or nothing phenomena, or not all, I should say not all or nothing phenomena, and those gradual transitions. Okay? I'm hoping no, people are still looking. I'll give you a second to read them quickly. Very good. Okay. Now what I want to do is turn to the third and the last part of this presentation. That's about the putative social facts, or about the facts, concerns about the facts, and I wanted to talk about, I say social cohesion and then cooperation, but this is really kind of the part of my point is precisely that these things seem to me to just kind of shade off into one another. And it's very, very tough, it seems to me, to sort of tease them apart. I don't mean to imply, in fact, you already know this because you've just heard Joe's talk, that the UBC group has no answers to the kinds of issues I'm going to be raising. But I just think that these things are worth a lot more consideration. Ora, again, in one of his works in this response, identifies an inevitable problem, and that is what he calls scaling up without splintering. I've been quite attracted to a paper that Robin Dunbar published, actually it's coming out, I should say, in which he points out a number of similarities between languages and religions. Both are critical to group identities and to social identities. There is actually new and very, very fascinating developmental work that both Emma Cohen, who you heard about in terms of doing research on rowing, she's also done research with babies in Brazil. And what she finds is that, in short, infants attend to and show differential responses, not to things like, for example, racial characteristics or anything like that, because Brazil is as racially diverse as any nation in the world, but rather to, does this person speak the language that and speak it in the way that I'm used to hearing, even after just a few months of hearing language, okay? Elizabeth Spelke has also gotten results like this at Harvard. One of the points that Dunbar makes on the basis of famous research that he did some years ago about looking at brain size and group size, that is to say, across primates, it looks like brain size correlates very strongly with sort of group size. And so, indeed, he thinks this is the key to the evolution of language. Because once your group gets so big, you can't keep grooming people. So you've got to find some new way to kind of groom the folks in your group and keep them happy. So language is really great. I mean, you can groom at a distance. That's a really terrific camera you've got back there. It's just working wonderfully, and I'm so pleased, you know. Or you can groom in parallel. This is one of the smartest, brightest audiences I've ever had. I mean, I haven't seen a single head nod even at this late hour, and nor hear a single stomach groan, given that people are ready to eat. His point, though, is that languages, and he suspects, like religions, tend to splinter. Okay, and they tend to splinter into dialects or into sects, right? And they tend to splinter at roughly those dimensions that are right along the lines of this issue about brain size and group size. The history of Christianity, or one might say, looking at what's going on in the contemporary Islamic world, hardly seem to be big God-driven group cohesion. There are routine schisms, let alone co-religionist wars and slaughtering, and it's indeed slaughtering. I mean, this is what's been in the news in just the last number of months, last month or so. Look, I know I'm going to take a minute more, but I haven't got a lot more slides, just 3 more. I'm going to stick in a footnote here, because I think there's a distinction to make that's worth thinking about. And that is between what I'd call the pro-social big God religions that have things like philanthropies, okay? And I take it that Christianity is sort of one of the leading candidates out there, versus religions that I think that have tended to be treated as big God religions. This is a point I should make under item 3 when I talk about big gods, but hang in there. That have, as it were, what I'd call sheer parochial altruism, okay? With no pretense of anything beyond that. Frankly, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to me that this is an accurate description of what many people regard as the fastest growing religion in the world, and that's the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. They don't have extensive philanthropies. They have missions, but the missions are all about proselytizing, right? When you heard, if you followed the American election a couple of years or a year or so ago, right? I mean, all those folks who were testifying about what a great guy Mitt Romney were people in his church, okay? All right. Now, this is resonant with findings, indeed, from the very study that Joe cited, okay, Joe did, looking at markets, religion, community size, and the evolution of fairness and punishment. Note, they say, as reputational systems break down in larger populations, increasing levels of diffuse, costly punishment are required to sustain large, harmonious communities. suggesting that large communities lacking sufficient and effective punishing mechanisms fragment into smaller groups as their community size reach about 300 people, and Joe told you about that, okay? That's not too far from Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is closer to down around more like 200. But the notion is that, you know, you can't monitor social relationships when you get out there bigger than that. And, you know, that's the big question, is how did we ever get over that in order to sustain large groups? And Joe's given you elegant account of one story. Yes, okay. The suggestion here is that social cohesion may be a term that covers many things, okay? And at least in a recent paper, well, very recent in the sense it's just come out in Current Anthropology, Harvey Whitehouse and John Landman have suggested that we fractionate social cohesion the same way that the cognitive science of religion has fractionated ritual. And they distinguish two, as it were, different, as they call it, ritual packages in two different kinds of settings, namely small-scale societies versus large-scale societies. One produces actually a more intense kind of social cohesion in the small-scale societies, what they call identity fusion. And they marshal a great deal of research out of social psychology to sort of make that case. It turns on dysphoric rituals that build intense social cohesion and loyalty, mostly in preparation for intergroup conflicts. Okay, my point, and as I said, this kind of just shades right into what I'm going to say about cooperation here, but social or group cohesion achievable by dysphoric ritual means in small-scale societies in the face of external threats. Yeah, okay, well that looks like it's one package, and as Harvey says, there's another package, right? Widespread cooperation with strangers lacking reputational information in large-scale societies. For much, much more than issues of mutual defense. But, you know, I mean, it looks like that's a continuum too. That's, I guess, really the point I want to make, let alone getting to things like social and personal morality of religions with big gods as moral monitors. Okay. I told you this was a simple talk. I've got a slide in effect that has one word on it, okay? I want to voice support. I want to really voice enthusiastic support for economic games and the kind of research that Joe discussed, and indeed that he has been a pioneer in carrying out. Since in addition to some precision, it seems to me they bring a common denominator to the discussions of the borderlands between social cohesion and small-scale societies in the face of external threats and widespread pro-social cooperation in large-scale societies. In the real world, right, in the prehistoric, looking at the prehistoric and the historical cases, it seems to me there's minimal agreement that this widespread cooperation surely must predate now agriculture because of Göbekli Tepe, for example. Okay, how did they build this if they couldn't cooperate? But if you look at the critical literature on Ara's book, for example, what you'll see is that really there's not much agreement, and I don't think much precision, about the evidence from other prehistoric and historical circumstances. So you have Agustin Fuentes talking about social cooperation in the Pleistocene. He talks about things like maintaining fires for groups. But can it sustain cooperation in large groups? As Joe's detail told you, and if you looked at it carefully, intergroup conflict is just rampant. Lawrence Keeley's wonderful book on War Before Civilization. I mean, believe it or not, he wants to argue that things in the developed world are actually much safer than they are in these small-scale societies. In another commentary, Leslie Newson talked about minimal differences between medieval European Christian villagers and the early Holocene horticulturalists. That is to say, folks who have big gods in the Middle Ages versus those horticulturalists. Okay, finally, last slide. About the big gods, third issue, factual objection. Seems to me there are two big objections out there. Beaumar and Boyer, this quote is representative of the first of those objections, and that is, the gods were generally, they're not much interested in morality. That's one of the arguments, okay? The gods were generally construed as unencumbered with moral conscience. We're back to that axial age, pre-axial age stuff, okay? And uninterested in human morality. This is the case of the gods of classical antiquity, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman. I assume we've got some experts in the room on these things. The same applies to the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca gods, and the classical Chinese and Hindu deities. Now, I mean, look, there just seems to be really fundamental disagreement about what the historical facts are here. So, we need to work that out, okay? The second objection about the big gods is that the gods of most large-scale societies, now here's the crucial phrase, it has nothing to do with this slide. I don't have a slide for this. I'm just going to tell you, okay? Is the gods of most large-scale societies outside of Abrahamic traditions and their influences were not big gods. Okay? This is argued by Quentin Atkinson. It's argued by Dominic Johnson, at least, those two folks. Ancient Greece and Rome, Buddhism, Hinduism, history actually of a lot of the history of Chinese religion, not all of it. They concede there's big gods maybe early on, but they kind of disappear. Okay, here's the question. Are these historical contingencies about related Abrahamic faiths and their influences? I mean, for the anthropologists, if there are in the room, I mean, the most conspicuous illustration here is cargo cults. Cargo cults pop up all over the South Pacific, and they seem to have forms that are just very much like each other and a whole lot like sort of a funny kind of form of an Abrahamic faith, okay? Or as what we've got, a general pattern driven largely by cultural group selection. I'm going to stop. I've used my time, but it seems to me this is the perfect set of issues for a room full of historians and area studies experts to take over. Thanks.